I'm Ariana Scott, and this is the Goddess Recordings, an independent documentary series from Signal Found Productions and the Trans Wiki Project. In our last episode, we traced how Raquel Reyes first stepped into the early digital frontier, how a carefully cultivated presence began to take shape at a time when most of the internet was still raw, anonymous, and unfinished. We followed the formation of a persona built not through institutions or corporations, but through instinct, collaboration, and emerging tools that were still being invented in real time. As technology advanced in the early 2000s, so did the speed and reach of circulation. Faster connections, broader access, and expanding platforms allowed what had once lived at the margins of the web to move outward. First across communities, then across borders. Raquel's presence no longer belonged only to a niche audience. It began to travel. But before we explore Raquel's rapid ascension online, it's important to understand what was unfolding in her personal life at the same time, because these events would profoundly alter the mindset she carried into her expanding professional world. In nearly immediate succession, Raquel experienced 3 devastating losses. After a long illness, her mother died. Not long after that, her biological father passed away. And then, a young man she would later describe in Goddess as the great love of her life also died. Suddenly, and without warning. These losses did not arrive gradually. They came in a compressed wave of grief that left little room for recovery between each impact. Mother, father, lover, gone in rapid sequence. In the midst of growing visibility, tightening schedules, and expanding audiences, Raquel was also moving through an intimate collapse. The private world was falling apart at the exact moment the public one was beginning to accelerate. It is impossible to separate the rise that followed from the grief that preceded it. Because what emerged after this point was not just ambition. It was urgency born of loss. In Goddess, Raquel writes of this period with unflinching clarity, characterizing her grief as visceral, disorienting, and relentless. She details how sorrow settled into her body, how sleep fractured, how silence became unbearable, and how the future stopped feeling theoretical and became immediate and volatile. It is here in this stretch of her story that some of her most self-destructive patterns take root, not as spectacle, not as rebellion, but as anesthesia. Raquel recounts developing what would later be described as a legendary appetite for partying, nights that blurred into mornings, environments where sound, light, and bodies crowded out thought. Sex became both connection and erasure. Cocaine and ecstasy, normalized within her social orbit, became the fuel she used to regulate pace, sensation, and longing. This was not hedonism for pleasure alone. It was a way of coping, shaped by the emotional management learned long before these years. When the world was too quiet, she made it loud. When the losses were too heavy, she made herself weightless. And when the future felt impossible to imagine, she lived entirely in the moment. What is striking in retrospect is not the excess itself, but how tightly it ran alongside discipline. Even in this period of unraveling, Raquel remained meticulous about her appearance, her image, her schedule, her contracts. The same woman who was numbing herself at night was also shaping a public presence with extraordinary precision by day. Grief did not stop the ascent. It braided itself into it. And as Raquel learned to move through loss by staying in motion, the world around her began to respond to that movement. Visibility was no longer confined to computer screens. It became physical. Print media came calling. For the first time, magazines that had never before featured a trans woman placed Raquel at the center of their pages. These were topless spreads in mainstream adult publications, spaces that had long enforced rigid boundaries around gender, desire, and who was allowed to be publicly wanted. Her appearance in those pages marked a rupture in representation that did not announce itself as protest or politics. but arrived instead as undeniable presence. The image had crossed over. Raquel began touring, dancing in clandestine transgender strip clubs in New Orleans, Puerto Rico, and then in Spain. The performances unfolded across a growing circuit that understood her not simply as an erotic entertainer, but as an event. Night after night, city after city, she moved through rooms thick with anticipation, transforming digital recognition into physical congregation. Her website became the organizing nerve center. Schedules were posted publicly, appearances were announced in advance, fans made travel plans, hotel rooms were reserved. What had once been a dispersed audience now began to assemble in shared physical space. Alongside the performances, another form of access emerged. Raquel began offering one-on-one personal meetings with fans, private encounters arranged through the same digital channels that had first delivered her image to them. Some traveled across states. Some paid thousands of dollars for only a few hours of her time. For many, the experience was not simply about desire, but about contact with a figure who had once existed only through pixels and screens. This was no longer just fantasy. It was the moment when the boundary between display and proximity began to blur. Raquel was now moving through clubs, airports, private parties in Los Angeles and New York, and hotel rooms with the same fluidity her image once moved through servers and hard drives. She had become more than an online presence. She had become a rising star in spaces that had never known someone like her. And with that shift, from digital visibility to international touring, from distant spectators to direct access, the years that formed the myth of Raquel Reyes had begun. Demand required structure. What emerged alongside her rise was a new kind of touring logic. Raquel's website evolved into a dynamic map. Dates updated, cities shifted, and audiences returned to it for information, much as later generations would refresh location-based apps. In structure, it echoed what platforms like Grindr or Tinder would later formalize: a system built around presence and immediate access. But this system operated in reverse. Those platforms disperse attention across countless users. Raquel's site concentrated that attention inward, directing a dispersed audience toward a single focal point. The line between visibility and access narrowed, and the route to her grew increasingly direct. In Goddess, Raquel notes that these years, the early 2000s, played out like a very long lost weekend. Time did not unfold in neat increments. Days collapsed into nights, cities into one another. Tour dates circulated, flights were booked, rooms filled and emptied again. Print appearances fed touring, touring fed visibility, and visibility fed demand. The structure no longer required explanation to those inside the machine. It simply ran. For Raquel, the pace was relentless, but purposeful. Movement had become routine. Stillness, increasingly rare. And yet, beneath the choreography of appearances and access, the interior landscape remained unresolved. The losses that preceded this ascent were not behind her. They travelled with her, packed quietly into late nights that seemed to go on long after the sun had come up. There is a particular tension that emerges when constant motion becomes a form of survival, because motion can carry you forward, but it can also keep you from stopping long enough to feel where you are. By this point, Raquel was no longer simply navigating visibility, she was navigating scale. Not just more attention, but faster attention. Not just more access, but constant access. Not just an audience, but a repeating public. And still, the emotional ledger underneath remained unfinished. Years in the fast lane had not resolved what came before them. They had simply given it speed. In Episode 4, we will follow what happens as access deepens, as intimacy becomes structured through economy, and as the boundary between connection and transaction begins to thin. And beyond that, we will later turn to Raquel's earliest pivot into autobiographical writing, and the deliberate reclamation of her digital presence through a self-directed erasure that proved striking in its scope and effectiveness. I'm Ariana Scott, and this is The Goddess Recordings, an independent documentary series from Signal Found Productions and the Trans Wiki Project.